Boker Tov, good morning. I'm honored this morning to welcome Rabbi Gilad Kariv, member of the Knesset and the chair of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee. Previously served as the president and CEO of the Israel Movement of Reform and Progressive Judaism, where he's been active for the past 20 years. He led the negotiation of the Kotel Agreement together with the leaders of the conservative movement, the Reform Movement, Jaffe, and JFNA, where, as we all know, resulted in the historic decision to create a pluralistic plaza at the wall. Rabbi Kariv serves in the Israeli Defense Forces Special Talpiyot project in the Intelligence Corps, holds a BA in Law and Jewish Philosophy from the Faculty of Law in the Hebrew University, and an LLM in Public International Law from Northwestern University School of Law. On a personal note, I want to say that Rabbi Kariv allows us, Israelis, the hope that we can shape our own Jewish life, just like here in America, and enjoy the civil liberties of marriage and plural. And very excited to present him this morning. With us, we also have the new Upper East Side Israeli Shlicha, Michal Abramov, and we'll welcome her today. We have with us Liana Miron Asif, the new head of delegation of Jaffe in New York. So it's an honor to welcome you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, friends.
Rabbi Kariv, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
It is wonderful to welcome you here. We have met many times in Israel, in the States. We've worked on things together. You are always welcome here. And when we heard you were in town for all sorts of meetings and, of course, the walk tomorrow, the parade with Israel, as part of a Knesset delegation, and we had the opportunity to welcome you here. We wanted to welcome you warmly, so Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you, Bruchim Hanimtzaim.
You have so many titles. You're a member of Knesset, you're a rabbi, you're an attorney. How did you, tell us a little bit about the story of your life that you became this person wearing so many hats and now in the Knesset?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me, and Boker Tov and Shabbat Shalom. It was a wonderful surprise to meet your new Shlicha, a veteran employee and leader of our movement in Israel, and you definitely succeeded to get the best Shlicha. And thank you for your warm words. I'll try to capture my biography in a short description. As a child, I grew up in an extremely secular Israeli family that at the same time was totally devoted not to the Zionist ideal, but to the Zionist project. My grandparents were deeply involved in the 1948 operation of building a new state in the IDF and in other national endeavors, and like many Israelis in the 70s and in the 80s, it was extremely clear that we live in Eretz Israel and we are Jews, but Judaism never played a very influential role in our lifestyle besides its national aspects. And since I was a very young child, it was clear to me that I want more in regard to my Jewish identity. And at the same time, since I was a very young kid, I was deeply interested in politics. I think that immediately when I learned to read, I started to read the Haaretz newspaper. And since then, that's the way, instead of exercise, I'm opening my morning.
Exercising your mind.
Yes, I'm opening my morning with Iton Haaretz. So those were my two big dreams as a child, to do something with my Jewish identity and to do something with politics. And the best way to combine the two dreams was to
become a rabbi.
To become a rabbi and a constitutional attorney. And to
Which has more politics in it.
Yes, and to Unfortunately, in Israel, the Rabbanut has more politics. And the reform movement gave me the opportunity to combine my old dreams together. And after serving the movement for 20 years, it was the right time to move, to jump to the political arena, and together with my good friend and party leader Merav Michaeli, we succeeded to revive the Labour Party a year ago, and here I am.
Here you are. And
Yes.
so as you are one of, I believe, 7 seats,
Yes.
is that right, in the coalition government
Right.
right now on the Labour ticket.
Yeah.
So I want to do one more, not personal question, but a little history lesson perhaps, because it seems that the thesis of your career is that the state of Israel can be both a Jewish state, but also a state that represents Western liberal democratic values. And that is sort of baked into the founding documents of the state, but it's easier said than done. So what has happened for those of people who may not know how church-state works differently in Israel as opposed to the United States, why is that so hard to make happen?
So let's start by saying that it's not my thesis. This is the basic thesis of Zionism. And people need to remember that from day one, the Zionist movement first was based on democratic processes of decision making. And second, really from day one, all Zionist streams, including what we call today, modern Orthodoxy, but including the first Orthodox Zionist players, saw Zionism not only as a political movement for the establishment of an independent Jewish state, they didn't use those words back then, but also as a national movement that is eager to develop a just society based on equal rights. And when you go to the fundamental writings of Herzl, both is a very practical plan in the State of the Jews, but also in his novel Alte Neuland, you can easily see that in terms of the 19th century, he spoke about this need to bring together the desire for a Jewish homeland with full commitment to what we call today liberal values or democratic values. And people, for example, tend to forget that decades before most Western countries welcomed women into the political arena, allowed women to vote. In the first Zionist Congress in 1897, we had women as delegate, and they participated in the voting process. So definitely the Zionist movement was one of the more small p progressive or democratic national movements in Europe and around the world, and it's extremely difficult to find even one fundamental Zionist document that doesn't talk about the need to establish a Jewish homeland and securing at the same time that this homeland will meet the universal democratic guidelines or standards. Now, why it is difficult? It is difficult because, by definition, the combination between an ethnic democracy or the concept of building a nation state and the universal democratic values, this combination, by definition, creates challenges. We live in a complicated world. Israel is not the only nation state in the world. Most of the new European democracies that were established after the collapse of the Iron Wall were established as nation states. in their constitutions. So we're not, we definitely don't fit the American model, for example, of democracy. We don't fit the French model of democracy. But this is not the only model of democracy that exists today. But we need to be sincere and open to admit that this combination between the concept of a nation state and universal democratic values at least creates a challenge that requires us to act in a careful manner and in a thoughtful manner. Now, after that, we all know that unfortunately Israel is still caught in a serious and challenging conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and actually between Jews and Palestinians in our ancient homeland. And like all countries that are caught in this kind of situation, it also creates many challenges to the delicate balance between democracy and security needs. When it comes to issues of religion and state, here, unfortunately, and I'm not trying to judge the founding generation of our state, because to sit today and to talk about the 1948 reality, it's not a serious leadership position. Okay, I'm not judging them, but we need to say that the founding generation of the State of Israel thought that we should not address the issue of religion and state at the first years of the establishment of the state. They preferred to use or to succeed the structures that were built by the Turkish Empire and then by the British Mandate in order not to deal with those issues. I think that Ben-Gurion and his partners didn't imagine the ability of traditional Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism, and ultra-Orthodox Judaism to revive in such a powerful way after the Holocaust. And there was another component, and we need to say it out loud. Our movements, the more inclusive denominations of Judaism, we were not there. And we need to be, courageous enough and transparent enough by saying that for different reasons. And yes, we have wonderful stories of Henrietta Sold and Abba Hillel Silver and Hannah Senesh, and they all grew up in conservative families or reform families. Everything should be said, but the truth is that while ultra-Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy invested themselves not in the political sphere of Zionism, but in rooting themselves in Eretz Israel, we were not there in 1948, and we didn't take part in shaping the way the State of Israel understands the delicate relations between religion and state. And in that regard, the two movements today are trying to close a historic gap. And for many years, and I'll end with that, for many years, whenever I met in Israel a group from a reform congregation in the States or a conservative congregation in the States, one of their first questions was, why are you not establishing a party and running to the Knesset? Why are you not sending reform or conservative Israelis to be members of the Knesset and to change the system? And my answer, and the answer of my colleagues in the Israeli conservative movement, was always that you first build a Beit Knesset and only then you can enter the Knesset. It's the other way around. Before you create a native audience, Israeli audience that cares for your values, that appreciate your contribution to the Jewish character of the State of Israel and its democratic values, no one will place you in the Knesset. And the reason why I'm today a Knesset member is not because I took a personal decision. Yes, I took a personal decision to run to the Labour primaries, but I tried it 4 times before I was elected. And the reason that I'm a member of the Knesset today is that there are today enough Israelis, secular Israelis, traditional Israelis, secular Israelis, liberal, religious Israelis from the 2 movements, from other organizations. We have enough Israelis that care today. And in that regard, I think that we really need to understand that I will do whatever I can in order to change the status quo. And today we have a prominent member of the conservative movement serving in the Knesset together with me, Professor Alon Tal, an MK from Blue and White, one of the leading environmentalists in Israel, a great scholar. He's one of the prominent lay leaders of the Israeli Masorti movement. So the 2 of us with other friends in our more, let's say, liberal bloc in the Knesset will do whatever we can in order to reshape the status quo. But in the end, the number of egalitarian congregations in Israel is more important for our ability to achieve this goal than the number of Reform and Conservative Knesset members. And this is something we need to understand. There are no shortcuts in that regard.
All right. I have about 8,000 follow-up questions.
You
and
should
by the
smile
way,
after
we're actually,
very long answer.
And what we're going to do, you and I will go for another few minutes, but as there are a lot of people here in the room, so we'll ask questions as well from the community. Yeah. I just want to, before we get into religious pluralism, because I think that's the substance of our discussion. Yeah. I'm well aware that you had the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, and I know that on this question of Israel as a democratic state, a Jewish state, there was recently a news item about a Druze soldier in 2018 who died and was killed in a special ops, and he was listed not just as an Israeli, which he was, but as a Druze, and it gets into this question of nation state and does Israel, and so I'm wondering with this NationState Bill, and it was so curious to see you and Lieberman on the same side of an issue, and I said, wow, those are 2 people I imagine don't agree on a lot, but you agree on this question of the challenge, the present day challenges. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
First, in regard to Lieberman, I'm glad that he discovered the liberal approach towards constitutional matters. Unfortunately, Lieberman and his party supported the basic law of the nation state. We thought back then, as the Labour Party, but also as the Israeli Reform movement, and I think also the conservative movement was clear about it, that first we don't need the nation-state bill. The concept of a nation-state is presented in Israel's Declaration of Independence, in other constitutional basic laws. It was a political move from the Israeli deep right. For years, Netanyahu didn't promote the nation-state bill, and in a certain moment, he thought this bill will serve his political campaign. This basic law didn't bring any constitutional benefit to the idea of a Jewish nation-state, and at the same time, it pushed back it pushed to the corner the Israeli minorities, the Arab minority, which is the largest minority, and the Druze minority. And the story of the Druze community in Israel is so painful because truly there is a long-standing alliance between Jews and Druze, even before the state was established. And when you understand that this basic law actually offended people that are contributing day and night to the security of the state of Israel, you understand that we face a problem. Now, I think that our camp that is devoted to the Zionist ideal, but at the same time is devoted to democratic values and actually don't think that Zionism has a future without a very strong democratic foundation. It is time for us to lead the necessary constitutional moves and public gestures towards the minority. If we are real Zionists, we need to understand that we can't celebrate the fact that we became to be a majority in Israel without carrying the responsibilities of a majority towards the minorities. I always say, you know, in the public debates I have with people from the deep right, I'm always saying, you are the real post-Zionist force in Israeli politics. Because you are not willing to accept the responsibilities of a majority. And if you are not willing to embrace the responsibilities of a majority towards the minority, it means that you are not really willing to celebrate the success of Zionism. You can't pick and choose. If you are celebrating Israel's independence and success, always we are telling our children, you know, if you want independence and freedom, you need to understand it comes with responsibilities, right? This is the basic teaching that we are sharing with our teenagers. It works also for states. It works also for nations. You want to celebrate your freedom and independence, take the responsibilities that come with it. What we need to do today, because I tend to believe that for political reasons, we will not be able to cancel the basic law of nation state. It will send a very difficult message in regard to the concept of nation state. What we need to do is to do 3 steps. First, we need to amend it. There is no good reason why after 74 years the Arabic language is not identified as a formal language of the State of Israel, but rather as a language with a special status. Why you need to do it? Okay, Hebrew is the spoken language, formal language of the, but can't you give the minorities this gesture that Arabic is a second formal language? So we need to do some minor amendments to the NationState Bill. Second, we need to legislate the concept of equality, of civil equality, in our basic laws. It's unbelievable that in 2022, the disciples of Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin, the two of them demanded that the concept of civic equality will be part of the fundamental values of the state, opposed to this idea to give a constitutional standing to the concept of equality that actually exists in the Supreme Court ruling and in many other pieces of law. And the last thing we need to do is we need to legislate a new basic law. I presented it to the Knesset. It will take a few years before we can achieve it. But if we have the basic law of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, we need to have another basic law, Israel as a democratic state. And then we will be able to balance the two core elements of our country. But again, it goes beyond the constitutional issue. You know, there was one of the Israeli Arab extremely influential Knesset members was Professor Azmi Bishara. He escaped Israel because, unfortunately, I don't want to say that he collaborated with Hezbollah, but there was a security issue around, and he escaped to Qatar. And the main flag of Azmi Bishara was Medinat Kol Ezrachea, the state of all its citizens. In order to say we should not be a Jewish state, we need to be the state of all its citizens. And he actually created a situation that if you say that the state of Israel belongs to all its citizens, you immediately belong yourself to the anti-Zionist or post-Zionist camp. But friends, by definition, a democratic state is a state of all its citizens. There is no other explanation to democracy. Democracy is based on the concept that all citizens are the sovereign of the state. And Israel should be the nation state of the Jewish people, and at the same time the state of its people, its citizens, Jews and Arabs and Druze and Christians. And that's what we need to do. It's not enough to talk about Jewish and democratic. I want the young Druze citizen, and I even want the young Muslim citizen, to feel that the state of Israel is not only a nice state to live in, or a state that is gracious towards minorities. In the long run, I want the young Muslim citizens in Israel to feel that this is his state, the same way it is my state. Now, I'm the majority. I fully support the law of return. I think that we can justify the desire to keep and to nurture the Jewish majority. I think that the Palestinian people deserves the right for self-determination in part of the land. I believe that many Arab nations are enjoying this right. The Jewish people is entitled for self-determination more than any other nation in the world because of our long history, and the state of Israel should be the nation state of the Jewish people. But at the same time, we really need to work hard in order to give the non-Jewish citizens in Israel the feeling that this is their state. This is the only way in the long run to secure the ability of Jews and non-Jews to live together in the state of Israel. And that's what we are trying to do. And that is why this government, I'm not addressing its sustainability. I don't know if it will take, 3 months, 1 year, or 2 years before the next elections. This is our crazy system. But this government already wrote a historic chapter in Israel's history by the fact that this is the first government that welcomed an Arabic party to the Israeli coalition, and this is not a left-wing government. This is a government led by a modern Orthodox politician that was the CEO of the Settlements Council. And as a prime minister, he is the one that invited an Arab party for the first time in Israeli history to the coalition government. And if this will be the only contribution of our government to the history of the state of Israel, dayenu.
So, back to religious pluralism.
Yeah.
And I think we're doing okay on time. I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up. So, I'm going to steal your line of, in the years to come, that before we get into the Knesset, we are
in the Knesset, but the Knesset is more important.
We have to build Batei Knesset.
Yes.
We have to build synagogues to effectuate change. We have to play the long game,
Yeah.
in other words, is what you're saying. We have to build a base, caring people have to live pluralistic Jewish lives in order for that to become law in the land, and funding and questions of what Karine was mentioning of marriage and divorce and civil liberties and otherwise outside of the Rabbanut. But it seems to me, and from a tactical point of view, right, we all read the news, we wonder, is the front line of this debate the conversion question? Is a front line of this debate the Kotel? Is, as American Jews, we're often asked, to get involved in this argument, that argument, something going on in the WZO or otherwise, and where do you see? And the worry is that if you push too hard on the Kotel, you lose the big picture, which is actually conversion, or the government might fall, right? So let them have the, so how should we be thinking about the tactical question towards, if the goal is to create a pluralistic state of Israel where there's more than one way to worship God?
So look, here again, I strongly believe that legislators, that politicians need to be accountable vis-a-vis their audiences. And they need to be brave enough in order to be transparent and honest. And we need to be extremely honest. And in that regard, I see all of you as my audience. Yesterday, when I addressed one of the Reform congregations in Westchester, I said to them, you are not Israeli voters, you are definitely not members of the Labour Party, and you are not helping me in my primaries, but I really see the audiences of the two movements, in Israel but also in North America, as our audiences. In that regard, I think that Professor Alon Tal, MK Alon Tal, my colleague, and myself, we really see the two of us as your representatives in the Israeli Knesset, the same way that we see ourselves as representatives of our Israeli voters. And we need to be honest and to give you an account. In order to build this government, this unique, strange, and historic government, we had to make a big compromise. It wasn't really in our personal hands, it was in the hands of the leaders of our two parties, but the truth must be said. In order to build this government, in order to end the core or the previous term of Prime Minister Netanyahu, our side, our bloc, had to do some serious compromises. One of them is about future negotiation or current negotiations with the Palestinians, for example, and the other one had to do with religion and state. You can read it in the coalition agreement. Actually, we agreed to sustain the status quo unless we reach a collective decision in the coalition, because this was the only way to prevent Israel from going to a fifth round of elections. And in that regard, we are the first one to say that this is not our dream government when it comes to religion and state. And for example, we're not able to change the legislation around marriage and divorce. We are not even able to push the government to fully implement the original Kotel agreement. We are caught in a very challenging situation in regard to religion and state. Now, if this is the basic reality, what can we do? Or what are the achievements? What are the things that we can achieve in the area of religion and state? So first, we prevented bad things from happening. It is quite clear that under a different government, one of the first bills that would have been promoted was conversion legislation, overruling the last Supreme Court overruling the last Supreme Court decision to recognize the validity of reform and conservative conversions inside Israel. It is clear that this was the first demand of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And we are now in a government that by definition is not changing the law around marriage and divorce, but is not touching also the legislation around non-Orthodox conversions. And I can give a very long list of bad potential disasters that we blocked in this government. Second, we changed the melody. And here the issue of diaspora, of Israel-diaspora relations is the critical issue. Friends, the previous government basically boycotted the non-Orthodox communities. We need to say it out loud. For 6 years, the Israeli Prime Minister didn't meet the leaders of the reform and the conservative movements, not in Israel and not in North America. And we suffered from a wave of incitement that was presented not only from the ultra-Orthodox parties. It was presented by the best partners of the previous prime minister. This entire melody is changed, okay, or changed. Not only Prime Minister Bennett met the leaders of the conservative movement and the reform movement. The Ministry of Diaspora Affairs is today under the leadership of the Labour Party. We are very close to sign an agreement between the Israeli government and the URJ, the Union of Reform Judaism, and United Synagogues of America to do joint educational operations with public funding from Israel for the first time. We established a new branch of government that deals with promoting pluralistic operations in Israel. It's a totally different environment between the Israeli government and world Jewry, or our movements. And the third thing, and I already mentioned it, we can achieve practical achievements or practical benefits that will help us to grow our movements in Israel, to establish new Batei Knesset, to help other secular, modern Orthodox, moderate organizations to root themselves in Israel. And again, I'm the first one to say that we don't have right now the political ability to change the legislation around marriage and divorce. We will be honest enough to go back to our voters in Israel and to tell them that the only way to do it is to build a government which is based on central, more liberal forces, and we need them to support us. But at the meantime, what we need to do is to make sure that we are using this coalition in order to set facts on the ground and to make sure that public funding is supporting the work of the conservative movement and the reform movement in Israel, that Israeli municipalities understand today that if they go against the basic rights of our local communities, there will be ministers that will pick up the phone and call the mayor and tell him, you can't ask me, to be sensitive to your needs, but you are harming our audiences. And that's what we are doing today in Israel. And last thing in that regard has to do with our dialogue with modern Orthodoxy. Look, for years, we are telling our modern Orthodox colleagues in Israel that slowly they will become to be the main victims of the Orthodox establishment in Israel. That in the end, they are the ones that are going to suffer from the takeover of the ultra-Orthodox parties over the Orthodox establishment. I don't know if you know, but today, for an Orthodox Jew by choice from America, it is more difficult to make Aliyah to Israel than a conservative Jew by choice. Today, if you convert in an Orthodox synagogue, if you find an Orthodox synagogue that is willing to convert you, but that's another issue. But if you go through an Orthodox conversion here, it is more complicated to make Aliyah to Israel. Why? Because when a Jew by choice from your congregation is asking to make Aliyah to Israel, the Ministry of Interior Affairs is calling the headquarters of the Masorti movement in Israel or the Rabbinical Assembly in Israel. They immediately approve that Park Avenue belongs to the global net of conservative congregations, and this guy or lady are welcome to Israel as new olim. When you're talking about an Orthodox convert, they are calling the chief rabbinate. And then the chief rabbinate starts to check the rabbi. And if it is not a black hat rabbi, it is a rabbi with kippah sruga, like Rabbi Luxstein that converted the daughter of President Trump. Then the chief rabbinate is starting to make questions. Now, we told our modern Orthodox allies in Israel, wait and see. they will not end with the non-Orthodox denominations. They will go after the moderate, modern Orthodox rabbis, especially when today we have a very exciting feminist, I don't want to say revolution, but something is happening around the issue of the status of women inside modern Orthodox communities. I met the Board of Rabbis of New York. They told me that they are, for the first time, are welcoming a member to the board, a woman who is an halachic leader in a modern Orthodox community in New York. She will not be titled as Rabbah, but she will be titled as Talmidat Chachamim, an halachic scholar. And they are going to welcome her to the Board of Rabbis of New York. So something is happening in the modern Orthodox community here and in Israel. And the ultra-Orthodox establishment is fighting it extremely hard. And for the first time, we see that major political players inside the modern Orthodox community in Israel start to understand that the ultra-Orthodox monopoly in Israel presents a threat not only to us, but also to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that it will immediately be translated to a political alliance. I'm not saying that immediately they will give up the concept of monopoly over domestic law in Israel. It's a process. It's an educational process more than a political process. But it starts. My seat in the Knesset plenary is next to a prominent leader of the modern Orthodox party of the Prime Minister. He is the chair of the procedural committee of the Knesset. I'm the head of the constitutional committee. And we sit together and we spend many nights together. Now, on my in front of my seat, there is a tall line of books, because I'm using those hours to study. And he told me once that it's not good for him, because in his synagogue, people are asking him, how come, all it's broadcast, how come they see that the Reform rabbi is studying Talmud and he's using his cell phone? But just think about the opportunity, the personal opportunity that I have today to talk with this guy. He never spent 2 minutes with a conservative rabbi or Reform rabbi. He knew nothing about Reform Judaism. Now I'm sitting next to him. He's a prominent modern Orthodox politician in Israel, well rooted in the deep Israeli right. And suddenly he hears about our pre-army program, and he hears about the conservative pre-army program in Kibbutz Hanaton, and he hears about Noam, and about Camp Ramah, and he hears about our synagogues. And I'm sharing with him how the local mayor of Gdera is actually blocking the Reform congregation there for 12 years from establishing a congregation, and how some of the conservative congregations are facing the same problems. And you see that slowly something is changing. So without suggesting that we are close to create a revolution around religion and state, I think that we moved forward in a significant manner, and we need to continue.
Do we have anyone with a question? Short statement with a question mark at the end. Brian. Right here. And we'll repeat the question because I'm not sure if people at home can hear it.
All right. Rav Kariv, thank you. How important is it to be, and I assume you're still the only Reform rabbi as an MK, how important is that, having that responsibility?
So the question, just for those who couldn't hear, how important is the responsibility to be the Reform rabbi MK?
Look, I believe it is important. That's the reason why I tried to be elected for a few times. I think it is exciting. I really hope that others will use my personal example, and that we'll see in the future more non-Orthodox or conservative and Reform rabbis and lay leaders taking this decision to move from Beit Knesset to the Knesset. I always say that once I leave the Knesset, I'm more than ready to go back to the Beit Knesset and to be a congregational rabbi. I strongly believe in communal work and in the huge contribution that we can bring as rabbis and educators to the Israeli society, but we need more prominent conservative and reform lay leaders and rabbinical leaders in the Knesset. And I think that I really hope that people will use, my example to say that this is something that can be done. We, as religious people, we don't always like to deal with politics. People are coming to this sanctuary in order to escape politics, right? We want 1-2 hours on our busy week that are free from politics. And it is always a challenge, how do you balance the idea that a synagogue is a safe house that protects us from, the noise outside and the headlines of the New York Times or Yediot Achronot. But at the same time, we all understand, there is an halacha in the Brachot tractate that you're not allowed to pray in a house without windows. And the reason is not in order to bring light into the synagogue. The reason is to create this bridge between what is happening inside the sanctuary and the real life outside. And we need to be very careful how to find the right balance between inviting people to enjoy Judaism and forgetting about politics outside, just to celebrate Judaism. And at the same time to remember that we need to educate our younger generation to be involved and to be politically active. And politics is not a dirty word. The most terrible thing that can happen to us as citizens of democracies is that the younger generation will think that normal people and smart people don't go and deal with politics. We need our finest younger leaders to believe that politics is the necessary arena and it's the right arena, and you know what, in the end, it's also fun. Really. In the end, it's unbelievable. You get the ability to implement some of your most precious dreams about the society you live in. You suddenly see that instead of being extremely angry when you read the headline in Haaretz, you can do something about it. When you are calling the Attorney General to ask him about something that happened, he answers the phone. Politics is also about, creating change. And I think that we really need to bring more excellent people to deal with politics. In 2 years from now, we are going to have municipal elections in Israel. I don't know how many national elections campaign we will have to do till those municipal elections, but one of my goals, and I think that the leaders of the conservative movement in Israel share with me this dream, I want to see dozens of lay leaders from our reform and conservative congregations in Israel presenting themselves to be members of councils around the country. And I think this is the way to upgrade our impact in the Israeli society, and I have a feeling that you are considering a political career. So my suggestion, start with rabbinical training in JTS, right? And then go to study law in one of your finest universities, and then run to politics.
Oh,
it's a good...
That's good. That's great. That's great. That is a great way to conclude. I hope you at some point pinch yourself and say, from a young boy in Tel Aviv reading Haaretz to actually being in the papers, effectuating small change, large change, short-term change, systemic change.
Thank you, Rabbi.
May you go from strength to strength.
I'll
We're
share with
honored.
you one sentence.
Please.
My mother, I'm reminding you all, she is a real secular Israeli. My mother told me the day after I entered the Knesset Toda Lael, now I understand what you do. So after 20 years of being, you know, a Reform rabbi, now my mother understands what I'm doing. A member of the Knesset, it's something she can get. A Reform rabbi, yes. Thank you, Rabbi.
Toda Rabba.
Thank you,
Toda
Chaverim.
Rabba.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you, everyone.
Wonderful.
All right, friends, let's go celebrate Judaism downstairs.
No politics.
No politics.
Discovered that when I'm jet lagged, I'm giving wrong answers, so I apologize.